And thank you, Lucila. Thank you for that. So we have Sarah Greenfield and Bob Wyatt. Sarah Greenfield's with Oregon DEQ, and Bob is with Northwest Natural, and they're going to be talking to us about River Mile 11 and the big project that was just completed there last year. We also are going to have Jim Kuffner, who's going to be talking to us about UAP and that amazing river campus that the University of Portland has been working on. But before we jump into that, we have a couple of announcements that we wanted to make, and I'm going to bring Sarah on to kind of jump us off on that there. Sarah Taylor. And Sarah, you can come on anytime if you are near, and if not, then.
No, I'm here.
Okay, cool.
Am I just doing my announcements?
Yeah, and if you have anything else to share with us, that's fine.
Okay. My one really fun announcement is that the River Trail in Linton is open, and we're going to have a celebration of that on August 1st, Sunday at 1 o'clock. If anybody wants to come, we're going to have music and some art activities. And our Voices of the Lower Willamette River Museum Gallery will be open. So that's in downtown Linton. And it's the first access to the river on the west side between the Broadway Bridge and Sauvies Island. And then I guess just to say the Jazz Festival is this weekend in Cathedral Park, Friday night, Saturday and Sunday. And lots of people that are involved in these meetings will be part of that booth. There'll be the CAG and PHCC, Baltimore Woods. So we're all going to be there. And so come on out and enjoy Cathedral Park and visit our booth. We're going to have an activity of painting wooden fish as well that we're going to hang somewhere along the river. So those are my fun announcements.
Great, thank you. And I have just a couple of quick ones here. We also have a casual community coffee chat. This is basically a very casual get together with community members who are interested and want to be informed about Portland Harbor Superfund site, and also a way for us to kind of get more acquainted with the staff with EPA and DEQ or any of the agencies that are working on Portland Harbor Superfund. So if you just want to like have something that's maybe not so structured, a little loose, and want to just kind of ask some questions that you haven't been able to get answers to, this is probably a good place to go, and just so that we can be very familiar with the folks who we are working with. Also, we're going to be having a cleanup at Cathedral Park. There's going to be 2 of them in August. So we have one that's going to be August 5th. And if you come to the one on August 5th, you'll get a free Frog Ferry t-shirt. So I imagine everyone's going to show up there who's on here tonight to get a Frog Ferry t-shirt. So that's happening on August 5th only for the t-shirt. And we're also going to have another one on August 7th. The one on August 5th, I'm sorry, is going to be from 5:30 to 7 p.m. So that's when there's a low tide there. And then there's also going to be one on August 7th from 1:30 until 5. The one on August 7th, we're going to be having some major equipment there to get some of those big pieces of concrete off of the beach at Cathedral Park. So if you want to see some muscle power, August 7th is the day to come down and join us on the beach cleanup. And August 5th is a time where you can show up and get that free Frog Fairy t-shirt. So that's that there. And without much ado on that, I think we can possibly go ahead and jump into our presentation tonight. You can also find all of those events too on the CAG email announcement that just went out. And so if you didn't get that information, get all that here, you can go to the CAG, to our email announcement or to our website. And I'll put those links into the chat so everyone have that information too. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you guys to Sarah Greenfield with DEQ and Bob Wyatt with Northwest Natural.
Michael, I saw in the chat a comment from Sarah about introducing Sarah P. Did you want to do that before we start?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Yes. We also have a new person who's helping the CAG with a lot of the important things that we need to be. She's going to help us stay on our toes and help us get some things done that we've been wanting to do for a long time. And that's Sarah Perlman. Sarah Perlman is going to be helping us out with the CAG board members, and she is pretty dynamo. So we're really excited to have her on, and we're hoping that her stay with us will maybe lead into her staying with us forever. We'll see what happens. We're so good to have you on board, Sarah. Thanks so much. Okay, so with that there, let's go ahead and jump into our presentation tonight, our first one.
All right, let me get this going. Let's see. 1 second, please. All right, can you see my slides?
I can see them now, Sarah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Sarah Greenfield, and I am DEQ's Portland Harbor In-Water Coordinator and also the project manager for the former Portland Gas Manufacturing Site, or PGM. And I'm joined here with Bob Wyatt of Northwest Natural. Northwest Natural is the party who actually conducted the cleanup. And so we are both really excited to be here to present to you all at last on this project that was completed just in fall of last year. And from DEQ's perspective, cleanup of the river upstream of Portland Harbor has been a priority dating back to the 1990s. And this is one of 7 sediment cleanups that we have completed since then. And it really is one of the last major legacy cleanup sites upriver of Portland Harbor. So this is a huge milestone for both DEQ's cleanup and source control program, because that work is really important to ensure that those upstream sources of contamination are addressed, such that EPA's cleanup in Portland Harbor can move forward. And I think it also provides a really good example of the various different remedial technologies and construction methods that you might expect to see for the different projects downstream in Portland Harbor once they go to construction. And so I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of background on the site and an overview of DEQ's selected remedy. And then I'm going to hand it over to Bob Wyatt, who gets to talk about all the fun stuff and go into details about the construction and the numerous different challenges that were successfully overcome to get this project to completion. So the PGM site is located on the west bank of the Willamette River in downtown Portland, and it's at approximately river mile 12.2. In terms of landmarks, that is just upstream of the Steel Bridge, and it's about half a mile upstream of the Portland Harbor Superfund site. It historically operated a manufactured gas plant, which once served as the primary energy source for the city of Portland between 1861 and 1913, until those operations ceased and were moved downstream as Portland expanded and grew. So the plant was demolished in the late 1920s during construction of the Portland seawall, which is still out there today. And during that demolition, building debris and materials were all sidecast from the upland into the river. Following that, major redevelopment, including the development of Tom McCall Waterfront Park, began in the 1940s, which involved quite a bit of filling back behind that wall to make it look the way that it does essentially today. And so it is home of the cherry blossoms that come around every spring, and where large Navy vessels berth each summer for the Rose Festival and Navy Fleet Week. So it really is really prominent and special place in Portland. The site was identified as a priority for cleanup back in 2008 by DEQ. And since then, multiple investigations have been completed to understand the nature and extent of contamination. And as you would expect, petroleum chemicals associated with the former gas plant operations really are the primary contaminants of concern. So there were elevated levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, cyanide, metals, and deposits of tar-like material in the river sediments. And it's believed that much of this contamination is from historic overwater dumping and releases that occurred during that seawall demolition in the late 1920s, which, if you look at this photo here, should really be no surprise. It was a pretty destructive event. And to this day, you could see, parts of the building, features, and things like that on the riverbed. And it was just left there over time. So now I'll go into a little bit of the DEQ selected remedy and permitting. So following all those investigations to look at nature and extent, DEQ reviewed and considered a variety of different cleanup options to address contamination at the site, and ultimately issued a final cleanup plan or record of decision in November of 2016. And the selected remedy is what's shown here in this figure. And it's a bit unique in that it involves a blend of a variety of different remedial technologies. So it addresses the most highly concentrated sediment contamination and tar deposits through removal and capping. So these are the areas shown in red, pink, and orange. Red was full removal. Pink was removal of that tar body material and placement of an amended cap. And orange was dredging to allow for placement of an armored cap. It also incorporates in situ treatment into a couple of areas, one being the depositional area along the seawall shown in green, and also an offshore area where surface concentrations were fairly low, but some buried contamination did remain. So that's that area labeled D, offshore. And then it also relies on or enhances natural recovery that's ongoing. It has been ongoing for many decades here. So in light blue, this is what we call enhanced modern natural recovery. So basically accelerating the natural recovery process by placing a clean layer of sand over the sediment bed. And then also just modern natural recovery, which is the area in dark blue, which is just essentially sampling over time to make sure that those areas remain below your cleanup levels. All in all, this project is relatively small, but does cover about 3 acres, just to give you an idea of the scale. So once DEQ selected a remedy, we go into the design phase. And so this is where Northwest Natural and their contractor spend a lot of time working with their engineers and technical experts to prepare detailed design drawings and specifications and reports that really outline exactly how the remedy will be constructed. And so I don't expect you to be able to read all the tiny print on this cross section. It's kind of challenging, but it's just one example of what you might find in a design report. And I think it does a good job of highlighting some of the key considerations that had to be accommodated in design. So as we talked about on the left, we've got the seawall. It's an old historic wooden seawall owned by the city of Portland, and the condition was unknown. So we had to avoid disturbing that during construction. There's significant sediment deposition along the wall that can be relied on because it effectively works as like a natural cap in that area. So you can see that steep slope starting from the wall and going down into the river. And of course, you need to make sure that the remedy provides sufficient draft for fleet week vessels. You know, you need to still allow those vessels to come and go and berth as they have for a long time now on an annual basis. And due to the presence of the surficial tar deposit, it was a priority to make sure that all of that material got removed. And so it's a little hard to see, but there is an area down in this third panel at the bottom. You can see a kind of gray surficial line that shows where that tar deposit is. So in the end, you know, what you get is a remedy that addresses the most heavily contaminated material, still accommodates future uses of the site, and takes advantage of some of the natural sediment accumulation that is occurring. And most importantly, of course, in the end, is overall protective of human health and the environment.
So Sarah, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we do have a couple of questions just before we go a little bit further from
Sure.
this wall. And there was a question about, did the plant convert coal or natural gas? Were you aware of that conversion, or was Bob aware?
Why doesn't Bob answer that question?
Well, it's a good question. The plant used a variety of different methods to create gas. It used coal, it used carbureted oil, and it used oil. In fact, the oil method was the most successful, and so that's why when we moved the plant to the area downstream, that was an oil gas plant.
All right, thank you so much for that. And then there was one more question about, it said, this was already, it said, what caused the collapse of the building in the previous photo, the earlier photograph? Was there any knowledge on what caused that collapse of the building?
Yeah.
When they dug the foundation for the seawall, they dug into the bank, and structures that were on the bank at that time basically were demolished and fell into the river.
Okay, all right, cool. And those structures just kind of stayed in the river, more or less.
We have some interesting photographs from divers that were evaluating the site before the cleanup that showed parts of walls that still had windows in them that we could match the photos when they were above ground. So I'll show you some pictures of some debris that we took out a little bit later in the presentation to give you a sense of what was down there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you.
All right. So then going into more of the design, here is just a typical cross-section of what the engineered cap that was placed in the river looks like. And it generally consisted of about 1 foot of gravelly sand amended with granular activated carbon. And so many of you are familiar with this, but activated carbon is a commonly used amendment in caps that helps to sequester the contamination such that it is no longer available to the environment. So as a key component of this cap. And then that's kind of the active treatment portion of the cap. And then of course you need to make sure that that cap remains in place over time. And so it was overlain by a minimum 1 foot of armor layer, which in this case consisted of stone with an average diameter of 3 to 4 inches. And that stone was designed to ensure that the material stays in place when subjected to a variety of different forces, including high river flows, vessel wakes, and it also considered movement from seismic events. So DEQ finally approved the complete design package in October of 2019, and that really kicked off the permitting process, which is a really complex, multifaceted process that's critical to getting your project into construction. And it requires coordination with a variety of different permitting agencies to make sure that that work complies with federal, state, and local requirements, particularly for the protection of cultural resources, historical resources, water quality, endangered species, public trust uses and future land uses as well. So at this site, it included coordination with US EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA's National Marine Fisheries, US Fish and Wildlife, our DEQ water quality program, the State Historical Preservation Office, which looks into historical and cultural resources and their significance. And then of course, DSL, who owns the submerged lands, and then various departments within the city of Portland, including the Bureau of Transportation and Parks. So all of that just to say that that is really a critical part of any big sediment project. It's a major hurdle to get through. And in this case, we were able to successfully get all the permits necessary to proceed with work in July of 2020, which coincides with the start of the Willamette River in water work window. So I'm not going to go through all the different permits here, but I think it's helpful just to understand the complexity of how much kind of coordination and integration is required to pull off something like this. So that gets us kind of through some of the background and the selected remedy design and permitting. And so here's where I'm going to hand it off to Bob to kind of show you all the pretty pictures and talk through how we actually get this work done. So Bob, I'll hand it off to you to talk through construction.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So as Sarah said, I'm going to walk you through the construction process. And so I'm going to talk about the things that we did to build the remedy that was approved. But we encountered quite a number of things that had to be dealt with along the way that were unexpected. And so some of the presentation is going to focus on how we managed through those things. So the next slide basically shows one of our operational areas. We had 3 at the beginning of the project. This is the actual project site itself. So it's where the dredging and the capping occurred. Another location was downstream on the Willamette River, where we amended sediments that were removed. And by amending, I mean we added concrete to them to help dry them out before we transported them to the 3rd location, which was upstream on the Columbia River. And at that location, we transloaded the barged materials onto trucks for transport to landfills. And I'm going to talk about those other stations a little bit further along, but right here, I wanted to give folks an overview of the work we did at the site itself. So looking at the site clockwise, on the bottom left, you'll see a little label for something called a moon pool. And a moon pool is a really creative method that was established several years ago for controlling water quality concerns during dredging. And so you'll see a platform that's basically a square in shape, and the dredge is sticking through that square. On each side of the dock that makes up that square, there are curtains that go all the way down almost to the bottom of the river. And so that double curtain essentially seals off the work zone from the rest of the river and keeps material that gets disturbed during dredging from migrating outwards. One of the things that you can't see in this picture is what's called a bedload baffle. And that baffle extends all the way around the project in a much larger arc. And that kept material that might have been released along the bottom of the river from bouncing downstream, basically. And then we had another boom that you can see basically in the top right-hand corner of the picture that kept anything that was floating from also escaping the work area. So we had basically a 3-stage water quality control and sediment dispersion control in place for this project, starting with the moon pool. The next thing you'll see on the picture going clockwise is the long stick excavator. And we dredged the majority of the site with that basically a stick dredger. And that's our preference because it has better control. We did have a crane on site for dredging deeper water because the stick can only reach so far down through the water column to get to the bottom and then into the sediments. But we had low water conditions for most of the project, so we were able to have very good control with that long stick excavator. Once the dredging is performed by that stick, that dredge bucket is the red bucket you see in the center of the moon pool. That pulls sediment out of the water and it's dripping. And so that gets moved across a splash plate so the dripping water doesn't fall into the river, and then over onto the barge, which is the next vessel away from you as you look at the screen. And that pile that you see there is the sediment itself that's been moved by that excavator over into that barge. The next vessel that you see past the sediment barges contains tanks, and those are blue, and those hold what we call elutriate, and that's water that drains out of the sediments because that water is contaminated too, and we didn't want that to go back into the river. And so we contained the water from the dredging, and then that water was transported for treatment prior to disposal. And then you see a number of support vessels and our GPS controls and all of the other peripheral pieces of equipment and engineering that we need in order for these projects to be successful. So that's just an overview of the site operation. Sarah, you can move to the next one. I mentioned earlier the debris. So we encountered quite a bit of debris as we expected. You can see a whole tree there being pulled out. We had fragments of brick and concrete. We got quite a bit of those. We even found a wagon wheel. And so some interesting things. Next slide, Sarah. On the left here, you can see a portion of the wall. So that's one of the walls that we were able to retrieve intact from the bottom. We also found an old anchor. And there was a lot of modern debris too, ladders, shopping carts, bicycles, and things like that. We even found an old safe that was open. So we had to remove all the debris before we could start dredging. And that was important because, once you start dredging, you don't want to stop and have to reconfigure all of your equipment. So we were really successful getting all of the debris out of the way, and then we started dredging. And so this shows the moon pool in use. And again, it's a close-up of that square that shows the structure holding those curtains. The center is a zoom in of what I described on that first picture, which is the splash plate. So that's the dredge bucket moving from the moon pool across the splash plate and into the barge that is holding the sediments once they've been dredged. And then the third picture here shows you the boats that we had in the area collecting water quality samples. Now, the river, as folks know, reverses direction sometimes with the tide. And so we established sampling points downstream and upstream of the work area. We identified what the background concentrations were before we started work. And then when we were doing work, several times a day, we would collect water quality samples in the downstream direction or the down current direction. Sometimes that was towards the Columbia, sometimes it was towards the falls, but we always knew which way the river was going, and we were always able to compare the results that we got during that sampling against the background station at the time. And we were very successful with that water quality program. We had no water quality issues at all during the entire project. Sarah, this is that video. Hopefully it'll work. This just shows the dredge cycling. So what you can see here is the dredge coming up through the moon pool. And if you're going to cross over that splash plate, and then once it crosses the splash plate, the loader will deposit it onto the pile there for the material that then gets transported downstream for amendment before disposal. And I don't know if you can see the motorboat driving by in the background. That will become an important thing for us to bear in mind as we get a little bit further down the presentation. And then on the right is just a close-up of some of the debris in the barge once it was removed from the bottom of the river. we had a surprise, and this happened just a couple weeks after we started work. One of our operators was out in the morning after our first day of dredging and found some ammunition laying on the moon pool platform. And we paused. We needed to find out what it was. It turned out to be World War II munitions. And so that was unexpected. And we had to identify what type of munitions they were. We had to determine whether or not we could continue to work safely, both as operators and also from a public safety perspective, before we could resume any work. And so we worked really closely with Sarah and her team at DEQ to try to figure out if we could keep going on this project. These were 20 millimeter rounds and a rifle bullet. You can see two 20 millimeter rounds and the bullet to the right of those. Turns out, as we were dredging, we encountered both practice rounds plus high explosive rounds, as well as incendiary rounds. And so after some research, and we brought in some experts in munitions, we determined that these rounds had the potential to have an explosive fragmentation range of about 73 feet. And before we could resume work, what we had to do is make sure we were safe working within that distance and had set up controls to make sure nobody else could come closer than that distance. So what we had to do was expand the area that we had fenced off along the park to keep pedestrians from being at risk. And we also had put spotters in the river to make sure any motorboaters that were going by either weren't close enough to be at risk, or we would shut operations down when they were coming by. And then we also built observation booths out of fragmentation-proof materials. You can see one of those in that picture on the right-hand side for DEQ and others to come and observe the work once we resumed. So we were shut down for a few weeks while we had to figure all of that safety elements out. But then there was another aspect that we had to manage too. And so, Sarah, you can move to the next one. And that's, what do we do with the munitions? We're not allowed to take sediments with munitions into a landfill. Landfills can't accept munitions. There's very strict regulations about that. So we had to sift all of the material that we dredged to make sure there were no munitions in them. Because some of those 22 millimeter rounds were separating the bullet from the casing, we had to sort and sift all of the dredge material down to 3/4 of an inch. And so we had to set up an entirely new station. We did this on the Columbia River on the North Shore. And this was a fourth station that we constructed for this operation. And so you can see in these pictures some of the sorting structures that we built. We had front end loaders with tremels and trommels that were used to sort. We had a Terex sorting machine as well. And then finally, in order to get down to that really fine level of scrutiny to get us to less than an inch, we had munitions experts that we brought in from around the country, and they actually sorted through them by hand at the very end. So not until we could certify that every single inch or less of sediment had no munitions in it could those then be placed back on a barge for transport to the landfill. So we resumed work dredging on August 10th. These are just some pictures of what we pulled up out of the river. You can see on the left there, a whole case of munitions came up in one bucket. On the right-hand side are both incendiary and high explosive rounds. The very bottom round that you can see on that picture on the right, there's a red circle on it. And that's just an example of where the casing and the cartridge came disconnected and why we had to look for such fine particles as we were doing our sorting. So here's just some more. Once we did find one mortar round, but it turned out to be an inert mortar round, so it didn't change any of the protocols that we had. It was the only one of its kind that we found, and it turns out that people used to bring them back from the war once they had been made inert. So it wasn't something that we were very concerned with after we identified the type of mortar that it was. And then you can see in the middle some sorting that we did. We didn't really know how many rounds we were going to get. Obviously, when we started, we didn't think it was going to be as many as we got. We got almost 400 rounds, 367. Got to the point where we were having the Air National Guard come pick them up, and they were coming out every day. And they basically said, we don't really want to have to come out every day. And we said, well, if you bring us a magazine, we can start storing the rounds in the magazine, and you can come pick up the magazine when it's full. And so they agreed to do that, and it worked out really well for everybody, I think, at that point. So that was that was a really challenging issue for us, and I just have to give kudos to the entire team. You know, DEQ was very supportive, very helpful. We could not have been able to work through this without them really working with us as a team. You know, both my engineering and my contractor team and DEQ, you know, is what made all of this successful. So it was just a great team effort. This is the transload facility, the one I mentioned at the beginning. This was the facility that I talked about that's up the Columbia River in the Dalles. And so what this shows is a crane that's moving material from a barge that's on the river over onto the lands, and then it goes through basically a funnel that is that guides those materials into trucks. And then the trucks went to either the Wasco County landfill or Arlington, which is a subtitle C hazardous waste landfill, depending on its constituency. So Sarah had mentioned the tar-like material that we dredged. All of that went to Arlington, but a lot of the sediment that we dredged out wasn't hazardous, so we were able to send that to the subtitle D Wasco landfill at Wasco County. Well, then September 10th hit, and we had another challenge that hit us, wildfires. Folks probably remember those days. It was a little scary. Our county was under a potential evacuation notice. Water quality was hazardous. It was too dangerous for the site crews to be out there. So every morning we would look on the federal and state websites to see what their water quality, the air quality index was. And then we would take measurements, and we would evaluate whether or not work could resume with controls or not. And we had several days where we were down. It was over a week because the air quality just stayed poor that entire period of time. It was around this time, I think, that we were all wondering, are we going to be able to get this work done before the in-water window closed? But fortunately, we were able to resume work once the air quality cleared up and the wildfires started to die down. And that was September 21st. So what I want to highlight on this picture, getting back to some of the engineering issues, on the left here, you see somebody with a hose basically spraying what looks like dirt. That's capping material, and that has carbon in it. As Sarah mentioned, the amended caps for us contain carbon, and the carbon is what sorbs the chemicals that's moving through the cap. And we want that carbon to be nice and hydrated, nice and wet, because it sinks better, and it will sink around the same speed as sand. And so we keep that saturated so it doesn't separate when we put it in the water. And what you see in the middle here is the bucket that was doing the dredging before is now taking this clean material and putting it into the river. Typically, an operation like this drops the sand in from above the surface of the water, and you could actually see the sand falling in. But we wanted to make sure that the carbon didn't separate, and we wanted to make sure we had really good control over the amount of material that was being placed, because we had some pretty tight specifications on our cap, particularly in the area where we wanted to maintain dredge depth for those ships that Sarah mentioned earlier. So we wound up submerging the bucket before releasing the capping materials. And that turned out to be a very good method for us because we had a very high carbon retention as part of that. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is somebody who's being lowered on what looks like a manhole, and it is. We designed and constructed ports that allow us to go back and sample water from the pores directly above the top of the cap. So this structure was placed on the surface that is the amended material. And then the armor was laid down around it. So it provides a window basically to the top of that cap. So we can go back at any time and measure whether anything is breaking through that cap. And we know exactly where that's coming from when we collect those samples. So these are some progress surveys. I didn't put a lot in here, but I wanted to give everybody a sense of what we were doing pretty much every day with DEQ. I remember several meetings, Sarah, where we were looking at these, making sure we were on track, looking where we had to go back, put some more capping material down, do a little more dredging. And so these colored squares tell you, based on bathymetric surveys that we were collecting, whether or not we were hitting our target elevations. And sometimes we were a little high, sometimes we were a little low. And every day we had to make sure we were exactly meeting our specifications or within the tolerances allowed. And so some of the areas we were more strongly concerned about meeting tolerances than others. And that's why along the shoreline, you'll see a very fine grid, whereas farther away from shore, the grid is a little bit larger, 3 by 3 foot versus 10 by 10 foot. And so we had to meet these very stringent specifications to make sure we achieved all of the objectives, both the protectiveness objective, which was obviously critically important, but also those future use objectives that Sarah mentioned at the beginning. And then this is verification maps for capping as well. Similar sort of framework here, just different colors to show whether we were putting material down versus taking material out. And then once we had achieved all of the correct depths or heights for dredging or capping, we did a final survey, which is the next map. And this shows basically the post-construction surface once all of the capping and dredging and M&R areas and EM&R areas and cover areas were complete. And this was the project completion figure at the end of several weeks of working really closely with DEQ to make sure we did it just right. And that was October 13th when we received that approval, which was within the in-water work window, which was a great success for us, particularly given the shortness of the window and the number of challenges that were thrown at us during this construction project. And then I'm just going to talk about a couple more things very quickly here. One's post-construction monitoring. Once we were done building the remedy, we wanted to go out in the same year and make sure it was working right. What were the conditions at the time of completion? And we can use this basically as a baseline for future years of monitoring. So we can always look back and say, well, this is what it was that first year. How does it compare to a future point? We collected a number of different types of samples. You can see here pore water samples that we collected through that cap I told you about. You see a Trident probe, which collected a different type of water, 3-point surface grabs. We had divers go down, and we also collected bathymetry information, and we collected surface water samples. All of that sampling showed that all of the remedial elements are working as designed, and we had no exceedances of any of the targets that we had set for this construction project. So we're very pleased with that year zero monitoring event because it shows what we built is working correctly. And then lastly, I think Sarah and I are going to tag team on this a little bit, but just the key outcomes, thought we'd walk through them for you. I mentioned this before, I don't think I can say it enough. The teams really worked well together. This could not have been successful if we hadn't had a team that trusted each other and relied on each other to do their jobs and do them well. I just can't say enough about that. We were also successful getting out all of the tar-like material. We were successful getting out everything we wanted to dredge. The moon pool was a success. That was a really important element of our project. And we also wanted to see whether it was going to be successful in the Willamette River, and it was. We were also able to get all the debris out. And as I mentioned during the slide when I was showing you the person hosing down the carbon placement was optimal. And we actually wound up having more carbon in the cap than the specification called for because we didn't really lose any during placement. So that was a very good success. We were able to complete the work within the in-water window. And then just a shout out to DEQ again for all their help in coordinating with the Air National Guard. And DEQ also led the public communications efforts and had a blog and everything else. And we supported them where we were asked to and where we could, but they did the majority of the work on that, and much appreciated. And then I also mentioned the sampling ports that were installed. And Sarah, I'm not sure why, but on my screen, that's the last one I can see. So maybe you could take over for me.
Oh, well, the last one is just the slide that you just presented that says that the year zero monitoring confirmed that the remedy is performing as designed, which is what we want to see, right? And so that is huge. And as Bob said, that's going to be the baseline that will continue to go back to those points in the future and verify that that continues to be the case. So I just want to, reiterate a lot of the things that Bob said. I think you all know these, but these sediment projects are really expensive. They take years to plan. And then when all is said and done, you have a 4-month work window to get the job done. And when there are unforeseen things like the munitions and wildfires and COVID, we didn't even talk about that. That was another thing. We really had everything thrown at us here at this project. And I think it really is a testament to, having motivated and creative, innovative teams working at this problem that we were able to get it done, meet all of our design objectives, and most importantly, make sure that the public remains safe while we were out there working with those munitions. So it really was a really good project. And as I said in the beginning, I think it's just a really good example that you can design for all of these things, but you always have to expect the unexpected. And we are sure to see more of this as work continues further downriver. So with that, I think that's it. And we can answer any questions anyone has.
Well, all right. That is an amazing story. That was super cool to hear. And so happy to know that we had great professionals doing a fantastic job on that. That mortar was, wow. So we do have some questions on the thread here. Let's see, some of these things you kind of already answered. So I'm gonna go through a few of these pretty quickly. And if I missed anyone's question and you wanna chime in to ask your own question, please just unmute and do so. But I'm gonna start off with, someone had asked, were the residues from the oil gas conversion discharged into the river for many years without treatment? If so, this must have been a real mess to clean up. So I guess that's a question, if it was or not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we have a lot of information on how everything was ultimately placed there. We do know that the tar-like material, which was the thing that we had the most concern with, and some of the higher concentration materials in the sediments were likely deposited when that seawall was constructed and material was cast out into the river when they were putting that seawall foundation in. One thing, Sarah, that we didn't mention was groundwater. There is a little bit of groundwater impact in the uplands, which may have been a result of actual operations at the time. But we were able to design a sediment remedy that addresses that issue as well. So the sediment remedy itself isn't just a remedy for the sediments, it's also a remedy for groundwater from the uplands.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. And then there was another question, was the Kuffner Dam dewatering and ODFW fish windle observed?
So we did not have a coffer dam. We used the moon pool for water quality control instead. And yes, we were able to complete the entire project within the in-water work window.
Yeah, and you answered that right after I wrote that, so thank you for that. Could you go back to that slide, though, that you showed the profile of the cap earlier in the presentation?
One.
Yeah, I think that's it. And is that a foot of armoring on top of that? Is that the carbon or is that the concrete? Or is that just, can you?
No, so the armor is actually a heavier stone that was spec'd in order to be able to resist the currents that we know are going to happen in the river. And so the armor is just placed to keep the river from basically disturbing the cap itself. The cap itself is largely sand or sandy gravel, and
Okay.
the carbon is mixed into that and placed before the armor is put on top of it to hold it in place.
Okay, so there's no concrete involved in the cap at all.
Correct.
Okay. Thank
So,
you.
quick follow-up.
Yeah.
You're gonna have Navy ships tying up right on top of the cap. So obviously you figured for prop wash from the ship that's maybe 5 or 10 feet above the cap.
Right. So we know that there's a lot of historical information about the ships, and we worked closely with all of the parties, including the harbor master, that deal with that. When the ships come in, they use what's called a breasting barge, and so they bring these barges in and tie them up against the seawall, and then the ships are tied against those breasting barges, not up against the seawall itself. And so that gives us a distance. And so we were able to use that breasting barge width to make sure we have a robust cap where we needed it there. And then we were able to achieve the depth that was necessary for the vessels to have enough draft where they actually will reside once they're brought in. And they're largely pushed by tugs as well. So their screws usually aren't driving them once they get that far up the river. So sorry, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered it exactly as I would have, but certainly consulted with a number of folks to make sure that those assumptions about the prop wash effects were understood and then built into the design. So we did accommodate some vessel movement, but it was based on the information that we got from the people who know how those ships are operated and how they are moored there along the wall.
Thank you. I had another question. I've always wondered what activated carbon is. I mean, in my mind, I have images from charcoal briquettes to coal to diamonds. So how does that originate?
Well, there are a number of different sources actually, and it depends on which one you get. Some of them are wood-based, some of them are other carbon sources, and you can work with a variety of different vendors to select the one that best suits the different chemicals that you are working with and the environment that you are going to be placing that material in. And it comes in a variety of different sizes as well. So I think Bob did a good job of describing how we were worried about making sure that the carbon doesn't separate, because it's a very, very lightweight material. You can imagine when you dry something, like a carbon flakes off of your grill or something like that, it's very lightweight and blows around. Same thing here, you need to saturate it so that it sinks. Other ways that you can do it is you can get it in a more pelletized form where it's condensed into larger pellets that will sink better, or you can have powdered carbon attached to stones that will then sink. So it comes in a variety of different forms with different costs and different pluses and minuses, but it's all essentially just, you know, a burnt organic product for the most part.
So is the carbon manipulated somehow that makes it activated, or is that just a term for the product itself?
I should know this.
Well, generally activated just means that it's unbonded with other things. So it has the capacity to sorb chemicals through it. And so you can even recycle carbon that has had things bonded to it by heating it up and releasing those. And that opens those receptor points back up again, so it can be used a second time to adhere the types of things that you want it to stick to.
Yeah.
I've been puzzling over that for a long time. Thank you. That was very good.
All right, so we got a few more questions here. What was the impact on community while you did this? Was there any type of air contamination or airborne PCBs?
Those are great questions. We monitored air quality the whole project. That was another thing we didn't have any concerns with. No exceedances of any of the values that we were looking for. And we did have a little bit of odor right at the work area, but we didn't notice it anywhere but right standing by the moon pool. And Sarah, I think you had a community observation that might have been carbon on the water.
Yeah, there was a community complaint at one point where there was an observation of what someone thought was an oil slick. But in actuality, what it was the activated carbon that we were just talking about kind of floating at the surface. And that was managed through the booms that Bob described that made sure that if it did float, it wasn't going to go outside of our working project area. And so that we followed up on that complaint and investigated it and make sure that that carbon was being managed properly and that we were continuing to take every effort that we could to ensure that it doesn't float to the extent possible. And then of course, other impacts were kind of simple things like the fact that that portion of the waterfront park had to be shut down and traffic routed around it for some time. And then once the MEC was found, that again, that exclusion zone had to get expanded for public safety reasons. So that was an impact, but pretty minor. But it is a very, very popular area. And so of course we wanted to minimize impacts to park users during construction.
Very good. Did you find any contaminated sediments beyond the project boundary?
No, I mean, the way this works is you investigate up front through multiple investigations to get a really good handle on where the sediment contamination is. And that was already done over many, many years. And so, we encountered, in terms of sediment contamination, what we would have expected. Of course, there were other things found that we hadn't accounted for, but the contamination that we were hoping to address was addressed as planned.
Okay. And was there a turbidity or suspended solids monitored outside of the work area during?
The water quality monitoring that I mentioned earlier was both for chemical parameters, but also for pH, turbidity, temperature, and things like that. So we look; those are standard dredge parameters. With the environmental dredge projects that we do in the Willamette, we often do the chemistry as well. But we didn't have any concerns on any of those parameters during the work.
And one question was the ammo from the Navy ships dumped during the Rose Festival?
I hope not. No, we don't know when it was dumped. We went through a number of historical photos and found that there had been a dock there at one point in time that a number of military vessels had been moored to, but it would all be speculation at this point when that material actually made it into the river.
Okay. And then there was a question about caps with windows to check their effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that? That was and do all caps have this feature?
Mm-hmm.
So no, not all caps has this feature. This is a new design idea that's only been used at a couple of sites around the country so far. But Sarah, if you go back to the one you were just on, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
If you look at the figure here, if you can picture basically removing a section of the pink armor stone and inserting a straw down through that to the top of the yellow. That's what we've done, is we've built a permanent, straw through the armor that sits on top of that gravelly sand. And that straw is filled with sand itself. And in that sand are embedded probes. And the probes have tubes that come out of their ends. So we can send a diver down, and what they do is they can attach a sampling device to the tubes that come out of that straw. And the water that they pull from those tubes are drawn from the probe ends that sit right on top of that gravelly sand with the carbon. And so the water samples that are collected by those divers are not from the armor, and they're not from sediments that have been deposited on top of the armor. They're from the top of that active cap material. And the reason we want to sample right there is because if there's ever any breakthrough, we want to see it as soon as it happens. And that's the best way to be able to do it. And it means that every year when we go back and sample, we can reproduce the location, both laterally, but also vertically, from where those samples are collected to make sure the comparisons are apples to apples. And so we installed more than one of those samples in the areas where the activated carbon caps were placed. But again, as you saw in the other slide, and Sarah, you might have been heading that way before I trapped you, we collect not just samples from those devices, but we also collect several other types of samples as well. So when we do our monitoring, it's pretty robust.
Okay, fantastic. All right, and I think we have one last question, and that is, did you encounter the intractable oily tar ball at this location too? So I think this is a Gasco connection possibly. So were there any tar balls at this area as well?
Well, so we did have a layer of material that was tar-like, and as Sarah mentioned, we did dredge all of that out. And the other tarry material that we removed was back in 2006. That was work we did for EPA under an EPA order for early action, where we removed tar from that site as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Is there any, we can maybe take one more question, and then our Q&A will be up for this section. Does anyone have a question that they want to unmute to ask our presenters here? Okay. Well, there's a lot of, Doug, did you have something?
I would just like to quickly thank Sarah and Bob. That was a fabulous presentation. That was complicated material. And most of us on the outside have no conception of how complex what you're doing is. And you helped our understanding of that enormously. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
There are lots of thanks for sharing what you've done. There's a lot of thanks and gratitude for the obstacles and challenges that you were able to successfully see through this. People are very interested in the cleanup, very fascinating, and sounds, happy to hear that it's a success story with all the challenges with fires and pandemics and ammunition. So thanks once again for that presentation. It was very, very, very interesting, enlightening, and love all the new tech that you guys are using for that site. And this totally gets us kind of psyched up and interested in what's going to happen in the rest of the river when we get all of these signatures in place. So very, very, very excited to see. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and introduce our next guest, and this is Jim Kuffner from UAP, and Jim is going to kind of talk to us about, how did the University of Portland come about, this river campus, and what was that process like? And So hopefully we'll get a little bit of enlightenment about a really potentially gorgeous piece of property right off of the Willamette River here in North Portland. So I'm excited about all the access that I'll probably provide there too. So without any further ado, Jim, I'll let you take this away.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate the invitation to be part of the group, and I see a lot of familiar names and some familiar faces. I wish that I would have as exciting a story as that last one. I have to agree that was one of the most interesting cleanups that we've been able to hear about, and we didn't have anything as exotic as that. We did find a few things that we were not expecting during the course of the cleanup. A completely buried dock, for one thing, and some giant pieces of coral that probably came back on empty barges for ballast from the prior operator when they sent them out overseas. But our project just was not as interesting as that, but it was pretty challenging. So let me just start by saying that the University of Portland, which I am retired from, so I'm not speaking officially on behalf of the university. I was obviously involved for many years with this particular project, not only the acquisition of the property, but the master planning and working with the various agencies, EPA and DEQ, to put the university in a footing where we could undertake a remedial action that had been approved by both parties. And we were a non-responsible party. We had never owned or operated that property before. And the property I'm talking about was formerly a 55-acre site that the last known operator was Willamette Western Rydell International, who was a worldwide environmental agency, a company that cleaned up oil spills and others around the world, as well as had a very active commercial barge operation. But the site itself had about 100-year history of a variety of institutional and industrial uses. So the property, when the university acquired it, it was important for us to get some recognition and some protection from the federal EPA and the state DEQ that if we were able to come into ownership of this property, that we would not be held responsible for any contamination that was on the site that had not already been discovered. And as someone mentioned, there were reams and reams, a stack of reports this high about all the previous sampling and whatever that had taken place on that site. And you'd like to think that everything that could be found would have been found, but of course you never know. And since the university had never owned or operated on that site, we were up above the bluff, 100-year history as an institution, a private institution of higher ed. We were excited about going down to the river to get our feet wet and do what we thought we could do to reclaim an area that had suffered with the hands of industrial contamination and whatever. So it was a big challenge for us, and we needed to know that going forward, we at least would not be responsible for anything that we might uncover during the course of the excavation and remediation that had not already been accounted for. The other thing is that the university, being an institution of higher education, we're not an industrial use, and the property was zoned for industrial. So it was very important that the city of Portland recognize the vision that we had for that property and allow it to be zoned in a way that educational and higher education uses would be permitted. And so the council agreed to do that and wisely put I guess I would say a condition on it that said, until and unless the university actually closes on that property and becomes a titled owner, then the zone would stay in place as it was. But once we were able to close the transaction to receive a deed to the property and then record that deed, then the zone change would take effect. And that was very important to the university. It was part of the master plan. We worked very closely with our neighborhood association, the University Park Neighborhood Association, in devising a master plan that kind of captured the vision of those that, hello, Tom, those that, saw what we saw was an opportunity to bring some contaminated site back into beneficial reuse for the entire community. And that's really what we saw. And I started out by saying that the original site was 55 acres. The amount that the university actually purchased ended up from Triangle Park. Mr. Zidell and his entity were the final owners that we purchased it from, was 35 acres. And the other 20, what happened is that when the company went bankrupt, the Rydell International went bankrupt in the 1990s, the property trustee offered it for sale. The university made a bid on it, kind of out of the wind, was unsuccessful in that, but we were able to acquire 7 acres of hillside land, including a little switchback road, which was called Bluff Road, which actually provided a secondary access to the property. And it normalized a boundary that the university had already of its property line, along with that 7 acres of hillside. And then the city of Portland, Department of its Bureau of Environmental Services, acquired an additional 13 acres at the foot of the bluff, right where the Van Houten railroad crossing is, and they have a big bioswale down there that they use for the benefit of the entire neighborhood area. So those 20 acres plus the 35 that the university ultimately were able to close on, which we closed on in December of 2008. It was actually December 17th, 2008. I'll never forget that day because we thought it would never come, but it did. It was a couple of years later than what we'd hoped, but we got there. And once we got there, that enabled us to engage in really serious conversations with the Oregon DEQ and the federal EPA about the nature and scope of what kind of cleanup would be required for the university to operate that property in a safe manner, but as well as restore it as much as possible to beneficial reuse within the community. And that, as you might imagine, was a lengthy process. It was many, many trips to Seattle, to District Region 10 headquarters, many site visits from regulatory agencies, the very list of that Sarah and Bob had listed, the very same entities the university worked with closely over the course of those years. And it actually took about 3.5 years from the closing in December of 2008. I guess I would say January 1st, 2009, we put up a fence along the railroad tracks. The Union Pacific Railroad had never done that. There were 4 public crossings that they had built, private crossings, I mean, across there, that we had hoped to retain at least one of them in addition to the public crossing. But we needed to protect that site at that point. Took 3.5 years for us to finally finish all of the work in terms of getting a remediation plan. The order that came down for the university was in the middle of August of 2012. Bob and Sarah had already talked about how you have that in-water window to work in the river. Our goal was to be ready on the 1st of June, and we were. Unfortunately, we couldn't begin until the middle of August. And so the middle of August set us back. We missed 2 very good dry months, June and July, and ended up on the back end with a couple of wet months in October, November, which made us kind of hustle to finish the land on the upland. We did manage to do all in-water work, which primarily involved disconnecting about 3 derelict docks and removing an old wall that was their riprap wall that was there to accommodate the old barges and other things that the former operators had used. Once we got finished, I mentioned along the way that we'd found some interesting items. We ultimately excavated about 60,000 cubic yards of material from the site. We did a pretty extensive cut and fill on that property. We relocated about 40,000 of those cubic yards into other areas on the site. And one area in particular, which is now the university is constructing a track on, a really beautiful track. Longtime neighbors to the university will remember that there used to be a track out on Willamette Boulevard in the early history, the 50s, 60s, and whatever. So that track is finally coming back. And we're able to use the fill that we put there from the excavation of the shoreline to raise that property up out of the 100-year floodplain and put it into the 500-year floodplain. So it's a much more, manageable use of that property. As we were excavating, we uncovered an entire buried, submerged dock that was down there, including all the footings and everything else. There were scads of huge pieces of coral that really, we believe, probably were ballast, that came back from tugs or barges that had hauled materials across the Pacific and then came back and would have some weight on them. And they kind of got deposited right there, so we were very interested in picking those out. We ultimately moved about 24 or so thousand cubic yards of soil to treated landfills. Some of it was able to go locally because it was not contaminated. Others was treated before it was left and went to those same landfills over in the Dalles and Arlington and that area. The amount of projects that we envisioned at the time was probably greater than what we were able to fulfill even now. The amount of additional regulatory requirements we are building, the university was able to build and operate now today 2 really beautiful soccer fields, one all grass, one with year-round surface. We have the new track underway, as I mentioned. A new physical plant building is being built as we speak. There are plans for an additional tennis center. And the one that I would hope we are able to do would be a boathouse and a dock for the university's rowing team. That requires still some very delicate negotiations between various agencies. That has yet to come to pass, but hopefully it will. There's a greenway. I saw some of my friends from the Portland Parks. There's a greenway trail that will be constructed on that site, which will, I think, provide a tremendous access and viewing areas for the public. It will be completed when the major construction on the property is completed. So it'll link next it'll be one of the connecting trails that starts out there at Kelly Point Park and comes in through, so hopefully someday they'll be able to have a continuous trail that goes all the way around the base of the bluff and maybe connects up to the East Bank Esplanade, who knows. That's kind of like an overview of where they are. I could talk about some of the challenges that we had, but you know what, I guess the biggest takeaway I have is that, people are the ones that make things happen. And luckily we were blessed with working with some really great people in some really tough times. It seemed like things would just, never go where we'd hoped they would go, but, people came through. And I have to be very grateful to, the neighbors and the community at large for supporting the university. We've always dreamed, of having some type of extended campus activity below there that takes that property and makes it something that everyone can be proud of. And I really hope that vision, which is underway now, will be fulfilled as soon as possible. So with that, I would be very happy to answer any questions or expound on anything, additionally, Michael. It's just been my pleasure to have a chance to chat.
Oh, well, thank you for coming here and sharing your story with us on such a short moment. Jim actually stepped in for another gentleman who we had scheduled to be here tonight, but he had a conflict with the time. And so he'll be with us again and will be providing us a presentation that would be much more visual.
Right.
We'll go into more depth about the river campus and the remediation efforts that was going to that. But Jim is also being a little bit shy too, because of all of the work that he's done. He's actually got a beach named after him at the river campus at UAP, at the University of Portland. So that's pretty exciting, and I can't wait to go and visit. I was the universe just kind of opened up and spoke to Jim to do this through his daughter, actually, who's a wonderful harpist, and that I met and realized that her dad was the fellow who helped with the acquisition of this. So it was something that was really special and kind of meant to be. So I'm really excited that he will be here. So with that, are there any questions that anyone have for Jim? Like I said, we will be doing this again, so he can probably answer some, but not all of the questions that you may have. But let's go and try. So if there's any questions,
I have a
ahead.
question, Michael.
Sure.
This is Dana Hubenthal. Hey, I wanted to know, it sounds like this is going to be a beautiful green area. Is this going to be a way that the fish, et cetera, can rest and get out of the heat? Is this going to be part of that path to let the salmon, et cetera, migrate?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. And I hope so. I mean, to be very frank with you, one of the projects that we envisioned from the get-go was exactly that. It was a resting place for juvenile salmon. It would be one of the only resting places of its kind available on the river. That was part of a natural restoration project, a natural project that is administered through the council that works most closely with natural historic restoration projects, and we haven't been successful in getting through there. There's been a lot of challenges in terms of erosion, trying to maintain native plants in an area that is very difficult. So I don't know. I think the Greenway Trail that I talk about is an upland trail. It's not in water. It'll have some viewpoints to the river. But as far as the migrating fish, the challenge is to try to, for the university, I think we may have to carry it on our own, like we pretty much have carried that whole project on our own. There were no federal funds, there were no state funds, there were nothing that the university had access to when we went through the remediation and the cleanup. It was generous donors and people who shared that environmental vision. I think now, Michael, I appreciate you mentioning Kuffner Cove. Kuffner Cove, if it is to be developed the way it was been envisioned, it would result in the removal of the remainder of those derelict piers and pilings that are there, and the building of a new rowing dock and a boathouse to accommodate it. And that project would involve then a low resting area for migrating juvenile salmon.
And the neighborhood has supported the university in all of these efforts.
They have. I mean, I can say, you talk about a shout out to a dedicated group of people who worked really hard with the university and shared, our vision, and also were unafraid to assert their own so that we could see, what was of interest to them. It was a great partnership. And the master plan that came out of that has many, many times been lauded by the Portland Bureau of Planning and by the commissioners as a model of cooperation between an institution, especially a sizable institution like the university that, is a non-conforming residential use that operates in a residential area, and how you can cooperate with the neighborhood association. So yeah, we're very proud of that partnership. Thank you.
Hopefully, Jim, the university will be able to have an exhibit or a digital presentation on the whole history of the.
I think they will. Yeah, I think they will. I wish Michael, you're very kind to recognize that I came here. What you see is what you get right here. I didn't have a lot of slides or whatever to talk about other than what's in my heart, and how I've lived in North Portland for 45 years. I was an employee of the university for 35 years. North Portland is my home, and it's a great place. It's a great neighborhood. And, I was proud to be part of this activity, that gives something back, to the neighborhood. So yeah, Tom, I think the idea of having a historical record, an archival record of all of that, there's a lot of material that is available. It would be just a matter of assembling it in a way that tells a good story.
And it looks like John Marshall has his hand up here. But I also wanted to say the name of that presenter who will have visiting us is David Hobbs.
David Hobbs, right.
And he's basically the major contractor with the University of Portland.
Yeah, he's the director of the physical plant, and construction. I'm sure he would have a much more precise, sketch of where projects are today, where they're going, which one will be next, et cetera. So,
Jim, you're great. You're doing a great job. We're all
thank you.
Grateful.
I appreciate it.
Okay, John, your question to Jim?
Yeah, hey, Jim, do you know if the university is entertaining the idea of possibly allowing a conservation easement on the portion of the property that is, adjacent to riparian areas, adjacent to the river, water areas, so that in case ever that property does pass into new ownership, that it would never be able to be developed for alternative uses?
Oh, well, that's an interesting concept, John. I will tell you that it's been my experience, and I've been helping the university. I did help the university purchase upwards of 70 properties over the course of the year. They're buyers and keepers, not sellers. Okay, I mean the next century of the university's operation was envisioned to be right there, part and parcel with the river campus, the Franz River campus. So I would say to you that there's very little likelihood that property would ever be sold. But, never say never, like you do, that concept of a conservation easement or something is one that I would certainly, not hesitate to have you, mention with David Hobbs or with other, individuals at the university in the administration, because they did take a sincere step a few years ago in recognizing, the original landowners, the indigenous peoples, and just, a statement of gratitude, to them, and recognizing, that we have a commitment to follow through in the stewardship of that land. And so, I think they would be open to something like that, at least a discussion. I don't know if it would be possible. I don't know what their attorneys would advise them, but.
Yeah, there's lots to that. It's not as easy as it sounds. But perpetuity is a long time.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Definitely.
Any other burning questions for Jim that anyone has to have for this evening? Okay. Well, Jim, thank you so very much for creating the time, and we're grateful that you were able to make it here at such a short notice. Jim was away fishing this weekend, I believe. And
yes.
I was determined to get a replacement to coincide with the great presentation that Sarah and Bob were going to be giving us tonight. So I felt like it was just meant to happen that we have a discussion about the amazing work that's happening at the university. And we'll continue this discussion with David Hobbs when the schedule works out.
Do me a favor and send me an invitation to that Zoom meeting, if you would. I'd like to hear what he has to say myself. Might as well keep him honest, right?
There you go.
I'd like to do a shout out to Mary Jared Kelly. Mary, it's great to know you're here. If you're still on, great gal from the Office of Neighborhood Associations in City Portland.
Yeah,
Thank you, Jim. Thank you
Hey,
so
Mary,
much. Great
all
to
right.
see you. Great
Thank
to see
you.
you.
Thank you.
okay, so I'm going to open this up to anyone who has any announcements or any news that they would like to share with the community here.
Oh, yes.
The upcoming events, news that anyone would like to share. Okay, so with that, I think we're gonna call it a night, and we'll be seeing everyone next week. Or next month, sorry, next month. I did put in the chat some of the upcoming events that are gonna be happening in August with the river cleanup, and also the Cathedral Park Jazz Festival and our community coffee chat. So that is in the chat down below. That information is also on the CAG's announcement and the announcement that EPA sent out today. So you could be able to find that there. You can also be able to find that on the CAG's website too. Thanks everyone, have a great week. Stay hydrated and be safe. Don't go near the fires in the southern part of the state. And take care of each other, okay? We'll be talking to you all soon. All right, thanks everyone.